Microsoft are in a spot of bother, aren't they? Launch Xbox One aside, they sell themselves on having the most powerful box, and this will no longer be the case. I wonder if Microsoft genuinely did not expect Sony to do a mid-gen refresh and have been taken by surprise. If they somehow manage to get a new console out in 2026, that's still a 2-year gap. Microsoft risk being in the same situation in 2028 when Sony inevitably release a more powerful box of their own. Feels like a fluke that Xbox 360 ended up broadly outperforming the PS3 despite the 1-year head start. It's hard to see the PS6 not being significantly better than an Xbox releasing in 2026. Where do they go from here to keep people interested in Xbox hardware until 2026 or maybe even 2028? Yeah, that's an interesting point. This one from 1040 STF. I was wondering, do you think Xbox should leave the 400 to 500 euro, I guess dollars applies as well, hardware market to Sony and release a super buffed up console, $1,000 console to create its own market? Obviously, some part of me misses the Neo Geo days when you could only wonder in the magazines on pictures of an inaccessible machine which games you could not play. I'm not sure that's really what Microsoft wants there. Except the market has changed, and today many people would spend $1,000 on the most powerful machine to mostly play Vampire Survivor. I mean, it's still cheaper than most of our phones. Interesting point. And there you go. You have your quote-unquote biggest generational leap ever. Microsoft is back at having the most powerful machine on the market, and we get GTA 6 at 60 FPS on launch day in 2027 after its 5 delays. Everyone is happy! Exclamation.
Still not out on PC at that point.
Yeah, good point. This one from Passive Meanness. Hello. Regarding the PS5 professional spec leaks and its supposedly meager upgrades beyond the quote-unquote amateur PS5, do you think Sony should instead develop a much more powerful but expensive console and create a new class of hardware for a new market with a lot more juice, quote-unquote, behind the hood, and some Steam Deck-like features for the power user, maybe? So there's two topics here, basically, as far as I can tell. There's Jake's, which is basically, what's Microsoft going to do, with this situation? How are they going to react to not having the most powerful hardware? And if they accelerate their next generation console to arrive in 2026, then, won't Sony just produce something better a year or two later? Interesting point. And there's this second notion of a much more expensive console that, it just provides a lot more horsepower. John, I'll go to you first on this. First of all, the Microsoft question. What do you think?
Well, before even that, I just love the phrase, are in a spot of bother. That's fantastic.
Well, it's a very British way of putting it. But yes,
indeed,
they are in a spot of bother, I'd say.
I would imagine that Microsoft was aware of the existence of this hardware, to some degree at least, with their Microsoft.
They would be aware of its viability and also the limitations in place.
Right. Frankly, I don't think that the hardware race is that important to them at the moment anymore. And I don't think just having more powerful hardware is the magic bullet that they need. That's not the problem with Xbox, right? It's not just the hardware. If that was, I think this would have been solved, because Xbox One is the only one that was arguably, Xbox One was a worse machine than PS4, but every other piece of hardware they've done has been great and quite capable, I would say. I almost feel, though, like this idea of doing a super expensive high-end box or even having the highest-end box is almost now diametrically opposed to the push for Game Pass and playing everywhere, where they're more focused on just getting games into as many people's hands as possible for the lowest possible price, right? Like, it feels like they've just changed what they're trying to do in general in the console business.
Well, you say that, but they're mooting the biggest generational leap ever for their next console, which kind of isn't really cost compatible, is it?
That's why I don't know. It's really hard to say what that even means at this point. And maybe they want to get back to that, but it just feels like that's kind of not what they're aiming to do anymore. But maybe that is. I don't know.
I think they need a focal point to sell Game Pass subscriptions, and that focal point is the console, because we've seen that it hasn't worked out. PC Games Pass hasn't shifted the needle, really. So I think they do need that focal point. They do need that console, and I think they need that handheld.
Handheld should be there.
Yeah, I mean, if you have
a
two-pronged approach, I mean, the SX model doesn't appear to have been the success that they hoped for, obviously. But if you have, a handheld X model where you have a really good console and a really nice handheld, I think that kind of solves that particular problem.
Big time.
I still think it's going to be cost. It's going to be a console, right? Which means it's going to be a mainstream proposition, which means it's going to have a certain cost limit attached to it, which would likely be like $500. Let's be frank. So I think that's basically where their strategy is. The question is, first of all, do they stay in this AMD-based arms race with Sony? Because they've, with the exception of Xbox One X, they've lost 2 generations now on the bounce by producing AMD-based hardware that isn't comparable to. It's comparable to Sony, but isn't that much better. I mean, you look at the construction of Xbox Series X, it should be producing better results than the PlayStation 5, noticeably better results, but that investment in the silicon in that really complex design just didn't pay off for whatever reason.
I just feel like talking about hardware these days, it's not that important right now. And there's just greater issues with game production in general, and like Microsoft's strategy in terms of just getting stuff out there. Like, I feel like they need to, before they have a new box, they need to figure out a way to get people excited in Xbox again.
Yeah.
Because even Sony is just kind of feels like it's coasting at this point. Like they did have the hype, but then there's just not much happening there right now.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is down to these super long development cycles, and just there's so many issues in general happening, and a lot of it is almost outside of their control, I suppose, and just the state of the world and the state of where games have tried to go that makes this so difficult. But it's just the excitement of like, here comes a new box. It's just not what it used to be anymore.
Well, the irony is, of course, that Microsoft has, on the face of it, a much stronger lineup than Sony from a first-party perspective this year.
Oh, this year? Absolutely. Yeah. This year. Yeah, no, this is the first year where they actually have a pretty like impressive looking lineup, which is kind of like when the Xbox Series X launched, it like landed with a thud. Like there was just nothing. Like it had Master Chief on the box, but there's like no Halo in sight, not for another year. And even then it was not up to what people wanted, and everything was extremely cross-gen. It just felt like more Xbox One. And I really feel like they missed something there with that jump. Like, I understand, like, it's a whole broad topic, but even things like the OS level stuff, like, I think by keeping the same OS, that actually makes sense, but it also created this feeling like Xbox Series X was just more Xbox One. There wasn't anything new or exciting about the hardware, and that's something that I feel is kind of necessary in the game space to get people hyped. Even if it ultimately doesn't pan out, I don't know, there needs to be something new and shiny for people to get excited by. And I think just more hardware specs necessarily isn't enough. Like, I don't think PS5 Pro specifically is going to go crazy in the mainstream. I don't think it's going to necessarily shift crazy units at all. We'll see. I mean, it depends on how they market it, of course, but...
Well, relatively, PS4 Pro and Xbox One X didn't do either.
No,
there was like an 80-20 split. I'd say 20% for PS5 Pro would be a great win for Sony if they can get that split going there. And maybe they will. Which leads us on to this kind of secondary point that's coming up, which is, is there a market for a super expensive console that's like, $1,000? I think there probably is, but it's very small.
Too small to
be possibly worth the bother.
I actually think the Series S has proven out that people like that has outsold Xbox Series X, and a lot of it has to do with the price, and people were more interested in the lower price versus spending more for the perceived additional power.
Right. To counter that, I'd say that there were availability issues with Series X. Certainly,
this is also true. Mm-hmm. But so too with the PS5. Both Series X and PS5 are really tough to get.
I think it's really interesting that Microsoft came up with this notion of, right, we've got the greatest generational leap coming. when, they've looked at Series S outselling Series X, and, you look at Switch, and, performance of the silicon isn't really the whole point of gaming in that particular sphere.
That's what I've been kind of rambling towards, is I feel like that this is something that Nintendo proved out, and Microsoft needs to find, not just copy Nintendo, but they need to find a thing that makes them unique and interesting, but also gets people genuinely excited again.
Yeah.
Because I feel like the excitement about modern game stuff has kind of decreased significantly in recent years.
One might argue that Game Pass was exciting in that, it is a really compelling subscription, but it's reached it's kind of plateaued at the moment.
Yeah, but like a subscription service is not the kind of thing that drives people to become fans necessarily. It's like getting excited about Netflix or Apple Music, like becoming a fanboy for Spotify.
The thing, you say that. The thing about Netflix is that, I'm currently on a subscription cull, which means that, Disney Plus, the price rises there have just been nuts. I'm not paying 110 quid for Disney Plus. I just cancelled it. But I'm never going to sort of cancel Netflix because, it's kind of good.
Yeah. And maybe that's the game they're playing, is like they're focusing on these services and slowly but surely gaining traction over time, and just people end up Game Pass becomes the de facto way. If you're going to do a subscription for games, that's what you get.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what they're trying to push for, and I don't know.
Yeah, but attaching a hardware purchase to that is a big ask.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. Alex, what are your thoughts on this? First of all, on where Microsoft sits in terms of its next generation hardware, and secondly, this concept of a I'd say a 2x cost box.
I don't know. I think 2x is far too far. Because at that point you're just like reaching like a territory of like people who's going to give out $1,000 for a console.
Well, I reckon that the 80-20 split would become like 90-10. And the question is whether that is viable or even worthwhile because developers would need to target that.
Yeah, it's a target platform specifically. For example, like you can have way more RTX 4090 users out there than sell this theoretical Xbox. But the developers aren't targeting RTX 4090. It just by virtue of the PC platform runs the game better. Right. And I think maybe that's like, I feel like if they're looking for angles that are interesting, Microsoft owns PC, but they never leveraged it after Valve took over the distribution of games from, third-party publishers, I would say. So I feel like they have an extremely unique ace up their sleeve that they own the largest like computer platform basis in the world for personal computers, but it's like not leveraged in an interesting way in the Xbox model. In fact, it's like a dirty word. Like it's like always constantly like, oh, this is coming out for PC. And we show the games off on PC, but we don't ever mention that, of course, because that'd be bad. But like, I feel like they could, with their next box, just leverage the fact that they are the PC platform much more easily, and it's a level of differentiation versus the competition too. I also do think that, at least like Richard said, they should probably move away from AMD, because producing like the same slightly different box there where the differences disappear in dynamic resolution is just like not compelling at all from like a hardware perspective. Yeah. If that is even the issue, which John talked about.
That we live in a world where PlayStation 5 could actually outperform Xbox or have higher quality ray tracing just does not compute to me. Something has kind of gone wrong from that perspective, especially when you're using the same part supplier. It's kind of crazy to me. But that is the reality that
whatever.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting arguments to be said about moving to Nvidia. I'd really like to see a kind of efficiency analysis of silicon area, because fundamentally, let's face facts, it's going to be TSMC producing the chips. Who gives you the best bang for the buck from your silicon area? Because that's one of the major cost aspects of producing a console. And, AMD's solution so far has been to put area first, right? That's why the ray tracing support isn't as compelling as Nvidia's, because Nvidia spent silicon budget on it. That's why you don't have machine learning acceleration on an AMD GPU, because they think, well, we can get more from the silicon by doubling down on rasterization instead. I'm curious how that actually works out when you factor in the fact that DLSS is so important. And obviously Sony has made that calculus now, right? And it has decided to invest in machine learning acceleration. So yeah, interesting to sort of ponder where Microsoft is going to go there. But yes, another AMD box with off-the-shelf AMD technologies may not be the best solution. And it's interesting, of course, that a lot of the stuff that's in RDNA 2 on Xbox, but not in PlayStation, like VRS, shader, sampler feedback, etc., it's either not shifting the needle for Xbox, or it's actually not very good at all.
Yeah.
So
they have the awkward position where they have like a more feature complete version of the hardware, but because everything targets Sony's platform primarily, don't forget people. It just, why would they use that? Like, just have it run at like a slightly similar to slightly higher resolution. Don't use the Xbox feature. Like, you see the same thing on PC all the time. It's like, it's not surprising. So yeah, they have to make it somehow different enough to make developers want to invest in it in a certain interesting way.
Yeah, but this whole concept of a $1,000 console, this goes back again to something which John's been talking about, which I'm actually getting a lot more on board with, the concept of Xbox OS just running on PC.
Yes.
Right? That
Heck
way,
yeah.
Because the thing is that, $1,000 console today would probably be really powerful. But then, 2 or 3 years down the road, $1,000 in PC parts or upgrades to your existing PC would actually, be a lot more potent.
Absolutely.
So that's something to bear in mind there. Maybe it is, something that they are considering, especially in the handheld space. But yeah, I think that's covered that one. So, yeah.
I mean, right now, I honestly think like that type of strategy is something that, like, Valve tried Steam machines years ago, right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't successful. The Steam Deck, however, has been a success.
Yeah.
I genuinely think that if they tried the Steam machine concept again and basically mimic the Steam Deck, like user experience in a console form, they'd actually find some decent success there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think they would call it like the Valve console, because I think Valve still very much associates themselves with the PC platform. And as a result, though, that box would, conceivably leverage the flexibility of the PC. And I think there's something really cool to that, to having it, because as we've seen, the idea of like, oh, it's a custom PC wasn't that interesting to me until I saw how they did it with the Steam Deck.
Yeah.
Where they add all these features that you don't get normally on the PC, like the scaling, the clock stuff, the dynamic, like adjusting like frame rate targets and all this stuff right in the menu. Like, that stuff's so freaking brilliant.
Yeah. Some might argue that is the Valve console.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's proven out that putting those things in front of the user is not a bad thing, and there is enough people interested in having those things while still getting more of a console like kind of experience. It's a really cool mix. Yeah. And I really think Microsoft should be looking in that direction as well, because they are the PC company. They own Windows. I think that they have a unique position where they could actually leverage that to create something very different for Xbox that Sony and Nintendo could never match, because they're just fundamentally such different companies.
I'm pretty sure that Microsoft could validate certain PC specifications that Xbox OS could run out.
Yeah.
They totally a Series X equivalent PC requires these parts or better.
And if they're in that PC space instead of the console space, like Consolized PC, then they could actually do these really expensive versions. It's like the Xbox Ready style PC, but it's like, here's the high end, kind of like what they've done with their Surface line, I guess. But if they can make really beautiful looking hardware designs, scale up the price from down like $250 up to over $1,000, just have a range of models that fit this mold, just transform what a console is. Like, they've already given up on physical media, unfortunately, but now that they've done that, it's like, just go ahead and embrace the PC, the digital sort of approach entirely. Just shift what they're doing to a different area that Sony and Nintendo will never follow.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it doesn't need to be Microsoft making the hardware. If you have this sort of specification, Dell, Alienware, Asus, anybody could do it. And of course, it would be a PC as well. You just install a different OS.
A ROG Xbox. I want a ROG Xbox.
I mean, if they handled it, I still think the way Steam Deck does the OS stuff is so freaking brilliant, where it's just like you're in Steam OS, but you just click a couple buttons and it just drops you right out to the Linux desktop, and you're using it like a normal PC, and then you just hop back over to the Steam OS, and it's just, I think that's so seamless and beautifully done. And they could totally do that with Windows. Come on now.